You know, it's interesting. We've got to a kind of position in our society now where nobody wants to think that they're not being discriminated against. It's really rather bizarre. We've placed so much value, so much stock, weaponized to such a degree being discriminated against that there appears to be a mad scramble and everybody wants to think that they're getting the shitty end of the stick. It's really rather bizarre, and it's to that backdrop that a study was published on the 3rd of January this year entitled A Simplified Approach to Measuring National Gender Inequality, and duly that generated quite a number of headlines, some of which were hyperbolic and went beyond what the report actually highlighted and said things like new report shows that in the West it's actually men that are being discriminated against, which was not what the report showed. I want to talk about several things in this video. I want to discuss the report, and duly what the report aims to do, I think, is to overcome some of the shortcomings of other reports, which it feels seems to give undue weighting to those things that we know in advance that women get the shitty end of the stick over, and or have a methodology by which countries are not penalised for women outperforming men. In other words, it's not really a true measure of equality, it's just a measure of whether women are doing well. And tries to provide what it sees as a more equitable and neutral yardstick. So I want to do that. I then want to look at the Global Gender Gap Report and Global Gender Gap Index, which is tied to that, constructed from that study, because this report differentiates itself from the findings and methodology of that report. So I want to have some discussion on that. I then want to talk about what I think are the failings of this report, and I do believe that this report suffers from failings, and I don't really have much more time for this report in some ways than I do any of the other reports, and then I want to tie all this together. As I say in my opening remark, I think we're in a situation now where nobody wants to think they're not being discriminated against, and duly I know that this is going to be a video that is going to find disfavour on both sides here. But I'm going to make the same comments with regard to this report that I would want to make if it had found in the opposite direction effectively, because I think the same comments are true in either case. So I hope you listen to what I have to say with regard to this. Some of you will have already read the report. If you haven't, you will have seen some of the articles on it. Let me try and give you a quick rundown of what the report shows. The first thing that I will do is read you out the opening paragraph, the abstract on the report. Okay, the Global Gender Gap Index is one of the best known measures of national gender inequality used by both academics and policy makers. We argue that this measure has a number of problems and introduce a simple measure of national levels of gender inequality. Our proposed measure is based on sex differences in the opportunity to lead a long, healthy and satisfied life that is grounded on educational opportunities. The measure better captures variation in gender inequality than other measures, with inclusion of outcomes that can be favourable or unfavourable to either sex, not simply unfavourable to women. We focus on some of the most basic measures available for 134 countries from 2012 to 2016, i.e. disadvantages in children's basic education, life satisfaction and healthy lifespan. And we relate these to various measures, including the United Nations Human Development Index. We found that low levels of human development are typically associated with disadvantages for girls and women, while medium and high levels of development are typically associated with disadvantages for boys and men. Countries with the highest levels of human development are closest to gender parity, albeit typically with a slight advantage for men. We argue that the disparities, when they are found, are related to the sexual division of labour, i.e. traditional gender roles in poorly developed countries, as well as the underinvestment in preventative health care in more developed nations. So first, let me say from my perspective, having had a look at this, there's a lot that I can commend. Having looked at these studies in the past and been personally irked with the way that they're carried out, it's great that they have gone against the grain and been prepared to outline in their study exactly why they've done so. And with just cause, I think, because as they say, a lot of these studies seem to deliberately pick upon the things that we already know in advance, that women are getting the worse end of the stick, and ignoring the things that we know in advance where men get the worst end of the stick. Allied to that, some of these studies also perform this trick where countries are not penalised for women outperforming men, they're only penalised for men outperforming women. So effectively you conspire a situation where it is impossible for men to be discriminated against in these studies. It is only possible for women to be discriminated against in these studies, as we'll find when we look a little bit later in this video at the Global Gender Gap Report and Index. They've tried to go away from that. And the other thing they've tried to do is to choose 3 metrics that are not obviously pointing in a certain direction. To give you an understanding of that, let me read you something that they wrote here, because bear in mind that one of the metrics that they chose was education. And we all know that in tertiary education that girls are outperforming boys both in terms of numbers and performance. And they didn't include tertiary education. If the purpose of this study was simply to show, oh, men are getting such a tough time of it in Western societies, then they would have included tertiary education. They didn't, and that's a real credit to them. And this is what they wrote with regard to that. For example, fewer young adult men than women enroll in tertiary education in most developed nations. Although this may represent a disadvantage for men, it may also simply reflect a preference for less academically oriented pathways into vocational occupations. Another example is the earnings gap between men and women, which may well reflect a strategic and desired division of labour within families rather than a disadvantage to women. Most of the other studies include these things, and what this study is saying is that effectively this makes the study in some senses not worth the paper that it's written on, because it's including these things which could just be as a result of aggregate choice differences between males and females rather than some asymmetry, fundamental asymmetry in society, which we should be taking account of. So they've tried at least they have tried to sidestep that. They have chosen 3 metrics within this study. One of them was education, as I said. It's just primary and secondary education and not tertiary education. The methodology behind that being that, of course, tertiary education, that is where the individual gets to decide for themselves where they're going to continue into education, whereas in primary and secondary education, either the state dictates that you will take part, or it is the parents that are imposing their choices on the child. So it's a much better measure, I think, of inequality. I would agree with them on that. The other 2 are healthy lifespan, which we can talk about later. And then the most interesting one is overall life satisfaction. There is a study that takes place every year. And what this study does every year is that it asks different countries around the world, it asks men and women around the world to scale their level of happiness on a scale of 0 to 10, and effectively gives them the question that 10, imagine the perfect life that you could have. Whatever that means to you, the perfect life, that would score a 10. Now imagine the worst possible life that you could live, that would score a 0. How would you score the life that you have today? And they ask people in different countries this, people different religions this, and they ask men this and women this. They have broken this down in country in terms of men and women and scaled these things. And these are the 3 graphs that they have created here. You can see on the y-axis that they have scaled it against Human Development Index. So we have countries of low development rather than the countries that most of us live in watching this video, with a high and the very high on that Human Development Index. And then on the x-axis, we have men falling behind and women falling behind. Don't worry about the colour of the dots at this moment in time. I'll explain that when we get onto the aggregated graph. What we're looking at here is the 3 individual metrics, and you can see the education one is the driving force effectively behind this whole thing because it has the biggest gaps. And you can see that what it's showing is that in the least developed countries, that it's firmly in favour of men, that it's women that are falling behind there. As you get into more developed countries, it starts to skew more in favour of women, that it's actually men that are falling behind, and that attendance rates at primary and secondary schools are actually greater for girls than it is for boys. In terms of overall life satisfaction, again, you can see there's a slight skew there as you get to the more developed countries in favour of women having a slightly higher level of life satisfaction than men. Healthy lifespan is, as you would expect, skewed in favour of women all the way through, that it's women have longer lifespans than men, and we can discuss how and why that is. And that certainly doesn't seem to get any better in the more developed countries. In fact, in many ways, the differential seems to be greater in more developed countries than less developed countries. This is the aggregate graph then. This is what it's all about, and this is what the headlines were about. You can see now where the colour of the dots comes in. So effectively what they did is they took the scores for those three previous metrics, they simply aggregate them together and divide by 3, and then they do 1 minus the score, which sort of inverts it, and the result of that effectively is you get this kind of graph here. What the coloured dots show is they show that which of those 3 factors, lifespan, satisfaction or education, was the biggest factor in arriving at wherever each country appears on the graph. But nevertheless, you can see that for the lowest developed countries, education is the factor that is most important, and it's the women that are getting the shitty end of the stick according to this, whereas in the more developed countries it tends to be men that are falling behind, and lifespan is the overriding factor, with the other 2 factors almost neck and neck. Okay, so very briefly, that is what is in the report and where it headed. It does also talk about obesity and alcohol consumption, but I don't think they're really relevant to this. I'll give you my thoughts on the report and its findings, what I think about it, a little bit later in the video. But I want to take a little bit of a loop here, but a very relevant loop, because I want to talk about the global gender gap index and study that goes alongside it, because this report makes a lot of mention of it, and I'll tell you what the report says about it in a few minutes. But this chimes into a discussion that I had with Kristi Winters a couple of years ago, and it kind of amused me in relation to what was said in that discussion. If you're not familiar with Kristi Winters, she is a YouTuber who has a channel that is dedicated to Sargon of Akkad. And she made a video back in the day, a couple of years ago, challenging Sargon of Akkad, who had claimed that in his view, gender equality had been reached in Western nations, specifically the United States. And she made the bold claim to Sargon of Akkad that if gender equality had truly been reached in the United States, then he would be able to give her the exact date when that had occurred. And I mocked her incessantly for this claim. But it was this idea that it should be easy and that everybody should provide the same answers. Presumably the same way that economists all look at the same data and they all arrive at exactly the same fucking conclusions, don't they? Because it was one of the most ridiculous claims imaginable from somebody who claims to be a social scientist. Not least because often what you have is you'll have some data from this time period, and then you'll have some data from 10 years later, and maybe over that 10-year period it may be clear that a shift has taken place and it's crossed a threshold, but you can never say exactly what date that threshold was crossed. That is just the most ludicrous thing that I'd ever heard come out of anybody's mouth. But on top of that, I also made the point that also, gender equality is a very, very amorphous thing, right? Some people will be talking about equality of opportunity, some people will be talking about equality of outcome, and even within those things, even within something like, even if you could agree, let's talk about equality of outcome, How do you measure it? What factors do you look at? How do you scale and weight them relative to one another? It's a very amorphous thing. So there isn't simply one objective measure of gender equality that we could have. Now, in response to that, Kristi Winters made a video criticising me quite bluntly. I will play you a short clip of that in a moment, but I can only play you a clip from the video that I'd made in response because, amusingly, she's taken that video down. I wonder why she took that video down. I can only suspect it's because it's so hideously embarrassing, the statements that she made there. But in response to her video, I made the following statement. And as I say, all this is relevant to this present study, I think. Yeah, and the way your study defines equality, and this was the global gender gap index we're talking about, is that if 100% of people in higher education are female, then your country gets a perfect score. In fact, if women absolutely dominated every sphere of social and economic life, they would rate that country as having perfectly achieved gender equality and would rank #1 in the world for gender equality. I assume that is also how you define gender equality, since you deny there are issues over agreement. To which she responded, yep, and the way your 10-year study, she quotes me, the way your 10-year study defines equalities is that if 100% of people in higher education are female, then your country gets a perfect score. Citation needed, she said, in the way that she loves to say. You're talking out of your ass again, Noel. Instead of admitting you're wrong, it is why I can't take you seriously. You refuse to educate yourself. Okay, so as a result of that, what I did is I gave her the citation that she'd required, and as usually happens with Kristi Winters, this has happened several times, when you give her the citation she needs, she never acknowledges it. She just either pretends you haven't made it or just changes the ground rules to something else. This is what I quoted her. This was from the study itself. Hence, the index rewards countries that reach the point where outcomes for women equal those for men, but it neither rewards nor penalises cases in which women are outperforming men in particular variables. Her response to this, and the only bits that I can show you here are the bits that's on my video, The Hypocrisy and Duplicity of Kristi Winters, because as I say, she's deleted her video, so I can't actually get to the exchange thread or the contents of that video anymore. But what she said was this. She said, you've gone from asserting that gender equality is impossible to measure to objecting to a hypothetical situation that has not been observed. And what I did was, I then made the following statement. If you object to the hypothetical, how about Sweden? Tertiary education, 1.53 women for every man. Score, perfect, 1.0. And so let me play you the clip from Kristi's video. This is the only clip of this that I have available, I'm afraid. But what we're talking about is this global gender gap index, my criticisms that I'd made in my original video, and this is what she had to say.
Firstly, to quote from him, people are incapable of agreeing as to what equality even involves. Well, clearly people are capable of doing that, because I've just shown you 3 studies that have been going on, one for at least 10 years, where people have been doing, at least defining equality in some way, measuring it and tracking it. And again, reasonable people can disagree, but just because something is hard doesn't mean you don't do it. In the social sciences, we deal with a lot of concepts that aren't easy to measure, but we don't throw up our hands and say, oh, it can't be done. We get off our butts and we get out there and we do it.
I have to say, it was kind of mind-boggling at the time to me, the exchange that I was having with Kristi Winters, that a social scientist seemingly couldn't get their head around something as simple as this to understand. Either that, or that a social scientist could be so, not just so biased, but so openly and unapologetically biased that they could unblinkingly make the kind of statements that they were making and refuse to accept that there is any bias or asymmetry in the way that this survey, that this study is being structured, and just carry on as if there was nothing to discuss with regard to that. Let me show you so you can understand here, because what we're talking about here is the Global Gender Gap Index. And so let me show you this, and then I'll show you what this new study has to say about the Global Gender Gap Index. So you can see here, these are the sub-indexes. I would have thought that should be sub-indices, but it calls them the Global Gender Gap sub-indexes for the United States of America. And duly you can see, in terms of economic participation and opportunity, in the first 4 categories where the female to male ratio is in favour of men, i.e. women are underrepresented, duly the United States is penalised in terms of score. But in the professional and technical workers category, where actually female workers are outperforming or outnumbering male workers, they're not penalised, right? Even though that has gone past equality and that men are underrepresented, it still gets a perfect score. The same with education. Literacy rate, enrolment in primary education, enrolment in secondary education are all around the equality point, and so they get a perfect score. Enrolment in tertiary education, women are wiping the floor with men, but it still gets a perfect score. It still regards that as perfect equality, even though quite clearly it isn't. Another interesting one to look at would be Norway. Here, enrolment in secondary education is off the scale. They can't even fit the bar on the scale there. 1.57 women for every man in tertiary education. It gets a perfect score for equality. In terms of political empowerment, duly women in parliament, women are underrepresented in the Norwegian parliament, and so it scores them down quite rightly for that, because this is measuring equality of outcome. But in terms of ministerial positions, there are more women than men in ministerial positions. We don't have equality there either. So really that ought to be scored down, but it isn't. It gets a perfect score. I could get my head around that. Wikipedia could get their head around that. So clearly Wikipedia are as stupid as I am. This is what Wikipedia had to say. The report measures women's disadvantage compared to men and is not strictly a measure of equality. Bear in mind, this was something that a social scientist, a public social scientist, Kristi was quoting, and understandably, because this is something that is thrown around the world as a measure of equality and how equal individual countries are. She was quoting this as the perfect example of an objective measure of gender equality. And Wikipedia is saying this is not strictly a measure of equality. Gender imbalances to the advantage of women do not affect the score. So, for example, the indicator number of years of a female head of state in the last 50 years over male value would score 1 if the number of years was 25, but would still score 1 if the number of years was 50. Due to this methodology, gender gaps that favour women over men are reported as equality and would not cause deficits in equality in other areas to become less visible in the score accepted for life expectancy. So Wikipedia is acknowledging that this is not a measure of gender equality. It's also giving us an indication of perhaps why the Global Gender Gap Index does that, because the Global Gender Gap Index actually doesn't give a crap about equality. What it's really about is looking at how well women are doing. I have no problem with that, but it's quoted as a measure of gender equality by all and sundry, including people who purport to be intelligent social scientists. Now, with regard to that, what I want to read for you is what the recent report had to say about the Global Gender Gap Index and Global Gender Gap Study, because it's differentiating itself from that study. So before I tell you what I think are the failings of this new report, let me tell you what it has to say about the Global Gender Gap Index. It says the following. Apart from political agendas, research on gender inequality has also almost exclusively focused on issues highlighted in the women's rights movement. Issues disadvantaging more men than women have been understudied for review, see number 3 in the references, and are not heavily weighted, if at all, in widely used measures of gender inequality, such as the highly cited Global Gender Gap Index. Further, the GGGI truncates all values such that no country can, by definition, be more favourable for women than for men. So this is the same issue that Kristi Winter said I was an idiot and didn't understand. They then go on to give you a little bit more detail. This is what they have to say about the Global Gender Gap Index. The GGGI, first published in 2006, is now one of the most established indices, I like the fact they use indices rather than indexes, of national gender inequality across the world. All included nations are ranked based on 4 sub-indices, namely women's economic participation and opportunity, educational attainment, health and survival, and political empowerment. These 4 sub-indices are each based on several variables, each weighted differently. The scores for each sub-index range theoretically from 0 to 1, whereby 1 indicates that women have parity or that men fall behind, given that values higher than 1 are capped. There are several different difficulties with the way the GGGI is composed. For one, there is no defensible rationale for truncating scores on an equality measure when they disadvantage boys or men. Absolutely, there is no defensible rationale if you're going to call it a measure of equality. Further, certain sub-indices may result more from choice than from a disadvantage. For example, fewer young men, this is the bit I read out before, young adult men than women enroll in tertiary education, and then it also talks about the earnings gap, which I mentioned before. Okay, so it then says the weighting of GGGI sub-indices is another issue. It is, but it's an important issue to bear in mind. So what this study then, to go back to this new study, is trying to do is to differentiate itself from the Global Gender Gap Index and to try and avoid some of the shortcomings of the Global Gender Gap Index. I hope I've given you a flavour of what they're saying in their report and how they feel that they've managed to do that by not including things like tertiary education. But I still feel that it falls flat. And it falls flat on 3 things, I think. The arbitrariness of the categories that are included, the issue of weightings which still don't go away, and we still have this issue of cause and causality, which is still important even with the things that they have chosen there. Let me try and elaborate on those 3 things. Despite the choices that they have made, you still have a situation where they have picked 3 things, and although they're 3 very worthy things, they could have picked other very worthy things. And so you still have this issue of choice and what is included and what isn't included. And the fact that some other things aren't included does mean that some countries such as Saudi Arabia, and I think most honest observers would look at Saudi Arabia and say there isn't a great deal of gender equality in Saudi Arabia, and yet that doesn't seem to show up in this study. So we can see by the results of this study that simply by what we know about countries, that it isn't really a particularly adequate measure that they've come up with. I don't know what the answer is, by the way, and that's part of what I'm saying and why I just don't like these things. The second thing is this business of weighting, which they've tried to get away from, but they still haven't managed. It brings me back to something that I remember, a parody that I remember in the British adult comic Viz, which used to parody the kind of thing that you would get in women's gossip magazines and also in newspapers like The Sun in the United Kingdom, where they'd have something like, who is Britain's worst Bob? And then they'd assess 2 Bobs, one Bob who is clearly a terrible person and one Bob who is maybe a character in a soap opera who does some despicable things. And they'd rate these 2 Bobs, and the first 5 characteristics would sort of be 7, 6, 5, 4, 8, 7. And then in the parody in Viz, the last characteristic would always be something that is utterly trivial but only pertains to Bob B. You know, the last one would be gossips about fellow celebrities in newspapers, and Bob B will score a 10 and the serial killer Bob A scores a 0. And although this was just something that was in a British parody comic, it actually makes a very cogent point, not just related to the things that it was parodying, but also to studies, which is that that there's an arbitrariness to the characteristics, and if you arbitrarily include something which is more trivial than other things, then you can horribly skew the results of the study. And the other thing is that weighting is critical. And what these parodies did is actually something that the Global Gender Index doesn't do. This study criticises the Global Gender Index for weighting different categories differently. What this study does is it takes 3 categories and it weighs them all the same. It gives them all an even weighting. But an even weighting is still a weighting. And it's only a legitimate weighting if all 3 categories are of equal import and absolutely differentiated, not in any way related to one another. And there is no more grounds for giving these 3 categories equal weighting than there is for giving them an unequal weighting. So that still adds another layer of arbitrariness to any findings that a report like this can have. The other problem, the third problem that I have that is still a feature of this report, is that it tries to get away from things that it sees like in terms of tertiary education and earnings, which are effectively confounding factors that are to do with people's choice. And yet the factors that it includes as issues of equality, there are still other grounds that would skew the data and whereby they may not be good choices. For example, it includes life expectancy as one of them. We know that in almost every society in the world that women live longer than men. We also know that that is a typical thing for mammals generally, that female mammals live a little bit longer than male mammals. It even acknowledges that in the report. So it's a little bit dodgy. We don't know the grounds for that. And it could just be that that is just simply that there will always be a residual. If everything else is equal and that men and women's healthcare and lifestyle were equal, that women would live a little bit longer than men. And that's just something that men have to suck up as one of the facts of life, right? It's effectively an inequality that is hardwired and not something that we should be judging a study like this upon. The same thing is true in terms of happiness. It could well be, and this study doesn't entertain this, that if you give a man and a woman on average all the things that they would need, a decent social environment, a nurturing environment, plenty of food, plenty of water, a decent standard of education, literature and television and all the things that they need to feed their brains as well as their bodies, a decent family environment, children to love and cherish, things to make them feel worthwhile, that women in that identical circumstance will just be a little bit more happier on average than men, that maybe women are just wired on average to be a little bit more satisfied with their lot than men. I don't know that. I know if you look at the work of somebody like Frans de Waal's Into Common Chimps, the way that he describes it, it is very clear that female chimps are a lot more content with their lot than male chimps. Male chimps spend their entire adult lifetime stressing about the fact that they're not the alpha male in the tribe and getting all the chimpy conjugal rights and trying to either get that top spot or bemoaning the fact they don't have that top spot, or if they have that top spot, they're constantly concerned that another chimp is going to literally rip their face apart and smash them over the head with a rock in a bid to get that top spot. So if it was chimps you were assessing, right, you would find that female chimps are universally happier than male chimps. We're not chimps, but there's no reason to presuppose that in the same circumstances, even if you made everything gloriously equal within society, that men would be as happy in the same circumstance as women. I know that the things that I'm saying here won't appeal to some people, because there will be some people who will just want me to say, great, we've got a study here that now contradicts those other studies and show that it's men that are getting the shitty end of the stick in modern societies. But I have to give you these points. These are the points that I would make if this study had found to the opposite conclusions. These points are still as valid now. Okay, so what I want to do at this point, I think, is to sum up. And to help me do so, let me first play you the last couple of sentences of what Kristi had to say in that video clip that I played you.
But just because something is hard doesn't mean you don't do it. In the social sciences, we deal with a lot of concepts that aren't easy to measure, but we don't throw up our hands and say, oh, it can't be done. We get off our butts and we get out there and we do it.
Yeah, so Kristi had made that claim back in the day that effectively my call was just a clarion call, if you like, for apathy. Oh, there's no way of scaling these things, so let's just throw our hands in the air and do nothing. But that was really a total misrepresentation of what I was trying to say. And if anybody has watched this video and gained that impression from what I've said, then you two are barking up the wrong tree. There is a very big difference between looking at different discrete areas of our society for inequality and trying to determine whether an inequality exists, whether that inequality exists as a result of a discrimination, whether it exists as a result of something we should try and do something about, and if so, what we should try and do to tackle it. There is a difference between those things and what I see as the absurd practice of trying to aggregate all these apples, oranges, pineapples and grapes together and try and come up with some meaningful single statistic that represents a country. I recommend to you, if you want to go on a little bit of a journey, to try and Google things such as ranking of the greatest country in the world or best country in the world, best nation in the world. You will find a series of quite absurd studies that aggregate very, very different things together that don't fit. They will aggregate things like access to healthcare, wealth, number of mega brands that a country has, the economic performance of the country, the sporting success of the country, and aggregate all these things together and then create an index where one country is the best country in the world and another country is the worst country in the world. And dependent upon which metrics you choose and how you choose to scale them, all of which are entirely arbitrary choices, idiosyncratic countries such as the United States can end up first on that list or 100th on the list. And this is the point. I'm not saying that wealth is not an important factor and an interesting thing. I'm not saying that national sporting success isn't something to explore. It's something that I'm very, very interested in. I'm not saying that welfare and healthcare provision are not important things. Of course they are. But to try and aggregate all these things together and come up with a single number for a country is about the most absurd journey that you could embark upon. And I propose this is the same kind of grounds that we are on here. To try and create some kind of index of countries and say which is the most equal and which is the least equal is a pretty absurd thing to do from the get-go. There are so many subjective, arbitrary points that you have to make along the way. I will give this study some credit in that it is attempted to earmark some of the failings of other reports, in some ways, the egregious failings of other reports that regard themselves as a venture into equality and yet are only interested in one half of the population. And effectively, you could actively discriminate against 50% of the population to the nth degree, and it wouldn't give a toss about it. And yes, they regard themselves as an exercise in equality. In some respects, this report, therefore, stands as a good thing in that it provides some counterpoint to that. Anybody who quotes one report, you can quote the other. Thereby, you then have to have a discussion about the shortcomings, both of the different reports and the shortcomings of these reports generally, thereby unearthing the fact that really didn't need unearthing, was that these reports are effectively a waste of time to begin with. Let me be blunt. The authors of this report justify what is in this report and the findings of the report. They could very easily have chosen other factors. They could have left out life expectancy and included something else and found that highly developed Western nations actually slightly favour men rather than women. And that is the problem with these reports, is that effectively they can show pretty much whatever you want them to show, and pretty much in any case whatever they show is entirely arbitrary. I put it to you that the devil isn't in the detail with these reports. The information, the useful information, is in the detail, and that the devil is in the lack of detail. Okay, interested to know what your thoughts are on this report and on how this report sits relative to all the other reports. I've talked for long enough now. I'm aware of that. Thank you for listening, and bye.